The factory floor churned with relentless energy, a beast that devoured hours and left men hollowed out. Everett felt its weight pressing down on him, grinding into his bones until exhaustion became as familiar as his own shadow. Sweat clung to his back, his shirt sticking uncomfortably to his skin as the deafening hum of machines filled the air, blending with the sharp tang of oil and scorched metal. He barely registered the faces around him anymore. Why would he? They were all cut from the same cloth, their expressions etched with the same weariness, their eyes dulled by the grind. When the whistle finally shrieked, signalling the end of another 12-hour shift, Everett didn't wait. He moved like a man on autopilot, bypassing the cluster of co-workers at the clock-out station. They lingered out of habit, exchanging the same tired jokes about showing up again tomorrow because they had no other choice. Everett didn't care to join in. What was there to say? The factory owned their time, their bodies, their futures, and gave them just enough to scrape by. Never enough to breathe. The bar greeted him with a familiar embrace. Dim lights cast tired shadows across sticky floors, and the faint sour smell of spilled beer clung to the air like a stubborn ghost. Everett slid onto his usual stool, the cracked vinyl creaking under his weight. He raised 2 fingers to the bartender, who nodded without a word, and moments later, a pint of something cheap and a shot of something sharp appeared in front of him. He stared into the amber liquid as if it might hold answers, some revelation about where it had all gone wrong. Why wasn't he enough? For the factory? For his family? For himself? The questions spun endlessly in his mind, as monotonous as the clatter of the machines he'd left behind. Around him, the other regulars filled the air with a blend of gruff laughter and hollow bravado. Their voices rose and fell, peppered with crude jokes and stories nobody cared to finish. Everett tuned them out. He wasn't here for camaraderie. He was here to drown, to let the drink wash over him until the edges of his life blurred and softened. Everett! The sound of his name pulled him from his thoughts, low and steady, like the toll of a bell. He looked up and saw Simone standing at the entrance. Her silhouette was backlit by the soft glow of the streetlights outside, casting a faint halo around her. Even in the dim, grimy bar, she looked out of place, polished, steadfast, and somehow luminous. A star in a place that hadn't seen light in ages. "Simone," he muttered, his voice gravelly and low. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she crossed the room. Her footsteps were soft but deliberate, and her gaze didn't waver. She stopped in front of him, her hand slipping into her pocket to pull out a few crumpled bills. She placed them on the counter without a word, a quiet gesture that spoke volumes. "Let's go," she said gently, her voice firm but not unkind. Everett hesitated, his hands gripping the edge of the bar as if anchoring himself. "I just need a minute," he mumbled, his eyes darting back to the drink. Simone crouched slightly to meet his gaze, her hand brushing against his arm. "You've had enough, Ev," she said softly. Her voice carried something deeper than concern. It was the quiet insistence of someone who'd carried him through these nights more times than she cared to count. "Come on. Let's get you home." Home. The word stung more than it should have. What kind of home did he even have to offer her? With a deep sigh, Everett let her help him to his feet. Her arm slipped under his, steadying him as they made their way out. The ride home was steeped in silence, broken only by the low hum of the car engine. Everett stared out the window, watching the city lights stretch and blur into streaks of colour as they sped past. He didn't look at Simone, though he could feel her presence steady and warm beside him. She didn't ask about his night or press him to talk. She never did. That was one of the things he loved about her, her ability to sense when he needed quiet. When they reached their one-bedroom apartment, Simone slipped the key into the lock, her movements precise and careful, as if not to disturb the stillness of the night. The apartment was small but carried the soft, lived-in comfort of a place they had worked hard to make their own. Inside, she moved through the cramped space with the grace of someone who had learned to make do. Their 2 children were already asleep in their tiny shared room, tucked under a patchwork quilt that Simone had sewn herself. Sadie, their 7-year-old, clutched a well-loved book to her chest, her little face serene in sleep. 4-year-old Eli sprawled on his side, his crayons scattered across the floor where he'd left them after dinner, a half-finished drawing of a rocket ship still on the table. Simone bent down carefully to gather the crayons, her movements slow and deliberate so as not to wake them. Everett leaned against the couch, watching her through heavy-lidded eyes. The exhaustion that clung to him all day felt unbearable now, amplified by the guilt he couldn't shake. "You don't have to do all that right now," he muttered, his voice low and hoarse. He closed his eyes, feeling the ache seep deeper into his bones. She glanced back at him, her face illuminated by the faint glow of the kitchen light. Despite the lines of weariness etched into her features, her smile was soft and patient, lighting up her tired face in a way that made his chest ache. "It won't take long," she replied gently. And he watched her for a moment longer, then let his head fall back against the couch, a long sigh escaping him. The words came before he could stop them, unfiltered and raw. "I thought it'd be different by now," he murmured, his eyes fixed on the cracked ceiling. "I thought I'd be different." Simone paused mid-motion, her hands resting on the small pile of Eli's drawings she'd collected. She looked over at him, her expression unreadable. "Different how?" she asked softly. "I don't know," he said, shaking his head. "Better, doing more, making more, giving you and the kids a better life." Setting the drawings aside, she walked over to him, lowering herself onto the couch. Without hesitation, she took his hand in hers, her fingers warm and steady against his. "Everett," she said, her voice calm but firm, "you already give us everything we need." He turned his head toward her, his brow furrowed with frustration. "I'm talking about money, Simone. A real house with enough space for everyone. Clothes that don't need patches, vacations, new cars, all the things we don't have." Simone tilted her head, her eyes never leaving his as she considered his words. Finally, she gave his hand a small, reassuring squeeze. "Those things don't make a family happy," she said simply. "We make us happy." She nodded toward the small cluttered bedroom where their children slept. "Sadie and Eli don't care if their clothes have patches. They care that you read them bedtime stories, that you cheer Eli on when he shows you his pictures and listen to Sadie when she talks about her day. They care that you're here." Her voice softened as she continued, her gaze steady and unwavering. "And me. I don't need more. I just need you." Her words should have comforted him, but instead they only made the ache in his chest worse, twisting it into something sharper, something heavier. "That's the problem," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Simone tilted her head slightly, her brow furrowing in confusion. "What is?" "That you're okay with this," he said, louder this time. Frustration edged into his tone, slipping through the cracks he couldn't hold together. "I don't want to settle, Simone. I don't want to spend my life scraping by." Her face faltered, the light in her eyes dimming. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence pressing in like a third presence in the room. She pulled away slightly, her body language shifting as if she needed space to breathe under the suffocating weight of his words. "Scraping by?" she echoed, her voice quieter but tinged with disbelief. "Is that how you see this life?" Everett looked around the room, letting his gaze linger on every detail he'd grown to resent. The faded curtains that had come with the apartment, the patched-up couch that sagged in the middle, the chipped coffee table they'd found at a garage sale. His eyes finally returned to her, meeting her steady, questioning gaze. "Yeah, Simone," he admitted, his voice heavy. "That's how I see it." Her lips parted slightly as if to respond, but no words came. Instead, she rose from the couch without a word, crossing the room to retrieve his worn jeans from the laundry basket near the corner. Returning to her spot beside him, she threaded a needle with practiced precision and began sewing a patch onto the knee. Her hands moved steadily, the rhythmic motion of the needle and thread filling the silence between them. "You don't have to fix those," Everett said, his words slipping out before he could stop them. His voice was rough, tinged with regret. "They're done for." Simone didn't stop stitching. Her faint smile was barely visible, but it was there, gentle and sure. "We'll get more use out of them this way," she replied simply. Something about the way she said it, so calm, so certain, twisted his frustration into tight, unyielding knots. He wanted to say something, anything, to bridge the growing chasm between them, but the words caught in his throat, trapped by his own turmoil. She glanced up at him, her features softening as she met his eyes. "You're allowed to dream, Everett," she said quietly, her voice carrying an earnest tenderness. "I'll always support you in that, but don't forget to see what you already have." He nodded, though the motion felt hollow. "Yeah," he mumbled, though he wasn't sure he believed it. Simone's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer before she returned her focus to the jeans in her lap. Her hands resumed their rhythmic stitching, and Everett felt like the room had grown unbearably small, like the weight of his own inadequacy had filled every corner. Later that night, as they lay in bed, Simone's breathing evened out beside him, soft and steady. Everett stared at the ceiling, his eyes tracing the familiar cracks that spiderwebbed across the plaster. His mind churned, restless and raw. To Simone, their life was enough: patched jeans, cramped rooms, and shared laughter. She saw a world held together by love, by small victories and quiet joys. But to him, it never would be. The week slipped by in a blur, each day bleeding into the next until Everett lost track of time. Now he sat on the cold floor of their bedroom, staring at the blank notepad in front of him, as though it held the answer to his mounting frustration. His fingers gripped a pen, but no words came, his thoughts tangled in a web of doubt. Around him, empty coffee cups lay scattered, silent witnesses to hours spent in the same spot, chasing an idea that refused to take shape. He needed something mind-blowing, something capable of bringing in real money, not just scraping by. From the living room, the soft hum of the vacuum cleaner punctuated the quiet. Simone's weekend ritual was in full swing, her determination to brighten their small apartment evident in every swipe of the vacuum and every rearranged cushion. Occasionally she passed by the doorway, her eyes flicking to Everett with a mix of curiosity and quiet encouragement. "You okay?" she asked, pausing by the counter with a damp rag in hand. Everett let out a heavy sigh, running his hand through his hair in frustration. "No, I feel like I'm going in circles. Every idea I come up with feels wrong, too basic or too risky." Simone tilted her head, studying him with that calm, steady gaze of hers. "Maybe the problem isn't the ideas. Maybe you're trying too hard to make them perfect before you even try." "It's not that simple, Simone," he snapped, though his tone lacked real heat. "Investors don't hand over money for half-baked ideas." She didn't flinch. Instead, she walked over to his notebook and tapped her fingers lightly against its blank page. "Okay," she said, her voice light but encouraging. "Let's brainstorm. What's one crazy thing you'd love to do if money weren't an issue?" "I don't know," he muttered, waving her off. "This isn't a game." Simone shrugged, unbothered by his dismissal. Closing her eyes briefly, she leaned against the counter, thinking. Then she spoke, her tone casual but deliberate. "What about something for people who hate doing laundry? Or an app that finds affordable childcare in real time? You're always saying it's impossible to find anything decent last minute. Someone would pay for that, wouldn't they?" Everett blinked, the gears in his mind slowly turning. "Childcare on demand," he murmured, the idea taking root. Then, suddenly, he straightened, his eyes lighting up. Wait. What if it's not just childcare? What if it's a whole platform? A service that helps people manage the small but time-consuming things in their daily lives, cleaning, tutoring, errands, all in one place. Simone's face broke into a wide grin. "There you go. Now you're thinking." The spark in his chest grew into a flame as he grabbed his pen, his hand flying across the notepad. Words and diagrams filled the page as he poured out his thoughts, each idea building on the last. The noise of the apartment faded into the background as he worked, his focus unbroken. Simone must have kept the kids occupied, knowing better than to let them interrupt when he was in this state. By the time he finished, an hour and a half had passed. The notepad was no longer blank, but alive with possibilities. Everett sat back, his chest rising and falling with the exhilaration of progress. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he'd accomplished something. Later that evening, he stared at his phone, debating his next move. There was only one person he could think to call, someone who could help bring the idea to life. His former co-worker, a sharp mind with a talent for tech, might see the potential where Everett needed help. The phone rang, and Everett braced himself for the response as he explained the concept. There was a long pause on the other end before the man finally spoke. "It's a good concept," his voice said, slow but thoughtful. "Let me reach out to some people. Give me a few days." Everett hung up, exhaling a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. A sense of cautious hope settled over him. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was a start, and for now, that was enough. The next few days dragged on like weeks. At first, Everett was brimming with excitement, riding the high of possibility, but as time stretched on, doubt crept in, gnawing at the edges of his confidence. What if the idea wasn't as good as he thought? What if the investors dismissed him outright? Or worse, laughed them out of the room? Late in the afternoon on the third day, just as he was getting ready to leave work, his phone rang. The sudden sound startled him, and he almost dropped it in his haste to answer. His heart pounded as he swiped to accept the call. "Hello?" His voice cracked slightly. "We've got a bite, a big one." His former co-worker's voice was electric with excitement, skipping over any formalities. "There's an investor flying in later today and they want to meet. This is huge, Everett, but listen, they'll want to see confidence. Be ready." Everett's chest tightened. The initial thrill of the news was quickly overtaken by anxiety. Confidence. "Right," he stammered. I'll get ready." He hung up and immediately called Simone, pacing the length of their small living room as the words tumbled out in a rush. "They're coming today. Some investor, flying in on a private jet. I have to meet them at the airport. Simone, can you make sure my suit is ready? It needs to be perfect." "Of course," she replied, her voice calm and steady. She placed her hand on his arm, her touch grounding him. "Don't worry. I'll make sure everything's set." By the time Everett stood in front of the mirror, tugging on the lapels of his freshly ironed suit, he hardly recognized himself. Simone stood behind him, smoothing down the fabric of his jacket with practiced care. She handed him his tie, her hands lingering briefly on his shoulders. "You've got this," she said, her smile radiating a confidence that he wished he felt himself. "Go show them what you're made of." The words stayed with him as he drove to the private airstrip. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows on the tarmac as Everett stood waiting, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself as a sleek jet taxied to a stop. The investor emerged moments later, an older man in a tailored suit that exuded wealth and power, his movements measured and confident. The meeting began tensely. In the sparse office at the airstrip, the investor scrutinized every aspect of Everett's pitch, firing off pointed questions about market research, scalability, and competition. For a moment, Everett faltered, his palms slick with sweat, as he stumbled through an answer about their target demographics. The investor's expression remained impassive, his silence heavy with judgment. Everett's mind raced, and for a brief second, he thought of walking away, of sparing himself further humiliation. But then he thought of Simone and the kids, of the years they'd spent scraping by, of Simone's unwavering belief in him when he had none in himself. It's now or never. He straightened his posture and took a steadying breath. Meeting the investor's gaze, he began again, this time with conviction. He painted a vivid picture of their platform as a groundbreaking solution to the inefficiencies of modern life. He spoke passionately about its potential to simplify people's daily struggles, emphasizing its ability to scale and dominate the market. As he talked, he could feel his confidence growing, the words flowing more easily. By the end of the meeting, the investor's stern expression softened into a smile, a small but unmistakable one. "You've got guts," he said, standing and extending his hand to both Everett and his co-worker. "I like that. Let's give this a shot." Everett could hardly believe it. He shook the investor's hand, his grip firm despite the tremble in his own. When the meeting finally ended, he practically ran out of the airport, his excitement bubbling over. The moment he reached his car, he fumbled with his phone, dialing Simone with shaky fingers. "They said yes!" he shouted the instant she answered, his voice so loud that a few people nearby turned to stare. "Simone, they said yes!" On the other end of the line, he heard her laugh, the sound bright and full of relief. "I told you," she said, her voice warm with pride. "You've got this, Everett." And for the first time in a long while, he believed her. The first months of the business were hectic but rewarding. Orders flooded in, users signed up by the thousands, and Everett's name began to circulate in the local business scene. He hired a small team, upgraded their office space, and finally moved the family into a bigger house in a suburban neighborhood. Simone was proud of him, of course. She celebrated his success with genuine joy, even as the late nights and early mornings meant Everett was home less and less. He missed dinners and bedtime stories regularly. The children needed him. So she had to talk to him. At first, he felt guilty. He promised Simone that it was temporary, that once things stabilized, he'd find balance again. But stabilization never came. As the business grew, so did the demands on his time. Meetings turned into conferences. Weekends were swallowed by travel. The house that Simone had painstakingly made a home became just another place for Everett to rest his head between trips. He bought a sleek sports car, took Simone to expensive dinners when he could, and showered the children with gifts he hadn't wrapped himself. "This is what we always wanted, isn't it?" he said one evening over dinner, his phone vibrating incessantly beside his plate. She looked at him for a long moment, her fork hovering over her plate. "I wanted you, Everett," she said quietly. Everything else. It doesn't mean much without you here to share it." He frowned, not quite meeting her eyes. "You don't understand what it takes to make all this work. I'm doing this for us, Simone, for the kids." She didn't argue. She knew it wouldn't change anything. But later that night, as Everett worked in his home office and Simone tucked the children into bed alone, she wondered whether they'd truly gained anything at all. Days had turned into weeks, and she could no longer ignore the chasm that had opened between them. He rarely called unless it was about work, and even when he was home, he was a ghost. Like a distracted figure gliding through the house, his mind far from where his body stood. She tried to rationalize it, telling herself his absence meant the business was thriving, but deep down, something about it felt off. One late afternoon, after an eerily quiet morning, she decided she couldn't take it anymore. The kids were at school and the house felt suffocating in its emptiness. She grabbed her bag and went to his office unannounced. He hadn't been home in days, which was now a usual occurrence. The receptionist greeted her with a smile that wavered when she said who she was. "Oh, hi, Mrs. Warren," the woman greeted, shifting nervously in her seat. Simone's brow furrowed. "Is Everett in? I was in the area and thought I'd surprise him." A pained look crossed the young woman's face. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Warren hasn't been in the office for the past couple of days. I thought he might be working remotely." The words landed like a blow. She managed a polite nod before turning and walking out of the building with different thoughts buzzing in her head. Where had he been? On the drive home, her worry grew. Could something have happened to him? Had he gotten caught up in some kind of business scandal he couldn't tell her about? Her imagination conjured 1,000 scenarios, each worse than the last. It was getting to 3 days and she hadn't heard from him. The urge to rush to the police increased each minute. By the time she got to the house, she was calling his number with trembling hands, praying that he was fine. "Hey, Simone." His voice was calm, relaxed even. Relief washed over her, but it was quickly replaced by a nagging doubt. "Everett, are you okay? The office said you haven't been in." "I've been worried." "Oh, yeah, I've just been taking meetings off-site," he replied breezily, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. "I'll be back later tonight, okay? Gotta run." The line went dead before she could say more. That evening, as the sky darkened and a cool breeze swept through the neighborhood, Simone decided to run out for groceries. Everett's favorite dish deserved the best ingredients, and after the day he'd had, she wanted to celebrate his success with something special. She walked briskly back home, her mind on the recipe, when the low rumble of an approaching engine drew her attention. A sleek black limousine slowed to a stop nearby, its polished surface gleaming under the streetlights. Simone's heart skipped a beat. It looked eerily like the one that had come to pick up Everett on those rare, thrilling occasions when his work started to show promise. She squinted, her hands tightening on the grocery bags, as a tall man in a tailored suit stepped out and opened the door for someone inside. When she saw him, her breath caught. There he was, Everett, his face lit with a smile she hadn't seen in years. He looked lighter, carefree, almost like the man she'd first fallen in love with. For a brief moment her heart swelled, thinking how far they'd come. But then another figure emerged from the car, a woman in a striking red dress, her laughter ringing out like wind chimes. The woman leaned into Everett with an easy familiarity, her hand brushing his chest, and then, like a punch to the gut, Simone saw her kiss him. Not a fleeting peck, but something more intimate, more deliberate. Simone's hands flew to her mouth as her groceries slipped from her grasp, thudding softly onto the pavement. Her heart pounded, her pulse roaring in her ears. She wanted to storm across the street to demand answers, to scream at him in front of the whole world. But her legs felt like lead, her body frozen in place as though rooted to the spot. She could only watch in stunned silence as Everett and the woman walked into a nearby restaurant, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. The short walk home passed in a haze, the sounds of the city muffled, her thoughts a jumbled mess. When she reached the house, she stopped outside to call the children, forcing her voice into a steady tone. "Something came up," she explained, her words clipped but calm. "I'll be home a little later." Once inside, her movements were automatic. She placed the keys on the counter with precision, set the groceries aside, and methodically put away the children's shoes left scattered near the doorway. But when she paused in the living room, her composure wavered. There he was, Everett, sitting on the couch, scrolling casually through his phone, looking for all the world like nothing had happened. The sight made her chest tighten, a sharp pain radiating through her ribcage. She thought she might break, the weight of betrayal pressing down on her. She could cry, scream, or demand the truth, but the faint sound of the children giggling upstairs stopped her. Their laughter tethered her to the moment, forcing her to swallow her emotions and lock them away somewhere deep inside. Drawing in a slow, steady breath, Simone stepped into the room, her face an unreadable mask. "You're home late," Everett remarked, not looking up from his phone. She smiled faintly, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "So are you." Her words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate, but Everett didn't seem to notice. He simply nodded, oblivious to the storm brewing just beneath her calm exterior. Dinner that night passed uneventfully on the surface. The table was set as it always was, the food served with quiet efficiency. But the air between them was thick with unspoken tension. Simone spoke little, her words clipped and neutral, while Everett kept glancing at her when he thought she wasn't looking. He sensed something was off, but he didn't press her, leaving the silence between them to grow heavier with every passing minute. The silence stretched on for days, a fragile tension that hung over the house like a storm waiting to break. Neither of them spoke about it, their conversations reduced to practicalities, school schedules, grocery lists, bedtime routines. But beneath the surface, every shared glance and unspoken word felt like walking on eggshells. Finally, one evening after the kids were asleep, Everett stood in the doorway to their bedroom. He lingered there for a moment, his shadow stretching across the floor. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet, but heavy. "You know, don't you?" Simone sat on the edge of the bed, her back to him. Her fingers toyed absently with the hem of her shirt, but her posture was rigid, braced. She didn't look up right away. "I saw you," she replied, her voice calm but laced with steel. Everett sighed, stepping into the room. He didn't sit beside her, keeping a cautious distance. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this, Simone. He hesitated, the words catching in his throat. "I've been unhappy for a long time." Her head snapped up, her eyes blazing with anger and disbelief. "You've been unhappy?" she repeated, her voice rising despite her best effort to stay composed. "Everett, do you even realize?" She stopped herself abruptly, closing her eyes and taking a steadying breath. She wouldn't yell. Not tonight. He sank into the armchair by the window, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't want to hurt you," he said softly, his tone almost pleading. "But for the first time in years, I feel like I'm living. I'm not working 12-hour shifts, barely scraping by. I feel free." Simone's laugh was bitter, sharp. "Free," she echoed, her voice low but trembling with restrained fury. "And what about me, Everett? What about this family? Did you feel free when we were patching up old clothes and praying we'd make rent? Did you feel free when I stayed up every night helping you figure out the business that gave you this so-called freedom?" Her words hit him like a slap, and he flinched, his face pale. He opened his mouth as if to respond, but said nothing, his gaze fixed on the floor. A long, heavy silence stretched between them, the weight of unspoken words filling the room. Finally, Everett spoke again, his voice careful and measured, as if afraid of shattering what little remained. "I think it's best if we separate," he said, avoiding her eyes. "Amicably, quietly. I'll make sure you and the kids are taken care of, financially." Simone's jaw tightened, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "I don't want your help," she said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "I don't need your money, Everett. You've already given enough." He looked at her, his expression a mix of guilt and resignation. Perhaps he'd expected tears, begging, or even a fight. But there was none of that. Just her unflinching gaze and the unbearable weight of her words. After a moment, he nodded once, stood, and walked out of the room without another word. Simone remained seated, her body stiff, her breath shallow. She didn't move until she heard the front door close behind him. The sound echoed through the quiet house, final and irrevocable. And that was when her composure cracked. Silent tears streamed down her face as she buried her head in her hands, her shoulders shaking under the weight of a heartbreak she hadn't allowed herself to feel until now. The walls she'd so carefully built came crumbling down, and for the first time she let herself grieve. Not just for the betrayal, but for the life they had once shared, and the family she had fought so hard to hold together. The sobs came in waves, raw and unrelenting. She curled up on the bed, her shoulders shaking as years of frustration, betrayal and heartbreak poured out all at once. She didn't notice the small footsteps padding into the room until Sadie's tiny hand rested on her shoulder. "Mommy, why are you crying?" the little girl whispered with her big eyes filled with concern. Eli followed close behind, clutching his stuffed bear. "Did Daddy make you sad?" Simone wiped at her face and pulled her children close. "No, sweethearts. Mommy's just tired." Sadie looked up at her. "Don't cry, Mommy. We love you." Eli nodded, wrapping his arms around her. The simple gesture grounded her, reminded her of what truly mattered. In the days that followed, she began to piece herself back together. The hurt was still there, not that she could deny it. It took more from her to explain to Sadie and Eli that their father wouldn't be coming anymore. The realization that a big house also needed to be maintained, and there was no money for that. So she started contemplating on what to do. However, she had to remember that she wasn't just a wife or a mother. She was Simone, a woman who'd once had dreams of her own. She remembered the spark she'd felt as a teenager painting murals at the community centre, the joy of creating something beautiful. Inspired, she picked up a sketchbook and pencil and started again. It was surprising that she could still do a lot despite leaving it for a long while. Slowly, the months passed by. Sometimes easy, sometimes it was excruciating. Someone had her make a mural for an event, and that was when she decided to focus on her artistic skill, hoping that it would bring something in for the family. A year later, Simone sat at her small but tidy desk, staring at the screen where her business plan glowed brightly. The journey to this moment had been anything but easy, but she had rebuilt herself, piece by piece, with sheer determination. Every sleepless night, every moment of self-doubt had led her here. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the room, mingling with the faint hum of the laptop's fan. "Mom, are you nervous?" Sadie's sweet voice broke the silence as she skipped into the room, her hair bouncing with each step. Simone turned, her face softening at the sight of her daughter. Sadie tilted her head, her big, curious eyes studying her mother intently. "A little," Simone admitted, setting her mug down and pulling Sadie onto her lap. "But it's the good kind of nervous." "Like before a spelling bee?" Sadie asked, swinging her legs. Simone laughed, brushing a stray curl from Sadie's forehead. Exactly like that. Her children had been her driving force. Through every tough moment, every step forward, their laughter and love reminded her that life didn't stop, even when it hurt. They had been her reason to get back up and keep building. She kissed Sadie's cheek, smoothing down her dress. "Be good for Mrs. Harper, okay? I'll be home by dinner." Sadie nodded enthusiastically before skipping out of the room. Simone took a deep breath, gathering her things and heading out the door. The event hall buzzed with energy. Entrepreneurs mingled in the lobby, clutching notes and practicing their pitches. Simone paced near the large windows, the weight of her presentation pressing on her shoulders. Her heart raced as she rehearsed the key points in her head. This moment could change everything. A chance to pitch her idea to a prominent investor, the opportunity she had been working toward for months. She checked the time nervously, glancing at the crowd. Just then, a young man with disheveled hair and a panicked expression approached her. "Excuse me, Mom," he said, his voice rushed. "I know this is unorthodox, but could I trouble you for some advice? I'm stuck on a problem for my pitch, and you looked so composed. I thought maybe you'd know what to do. Please, just a minute." Simone blinked, taken aback by his desperation. Her first instinct was to refuse. Her presentation was just minutes away. But something about his wide-eyed urgency reminded her of Everett, years ago, struggling for a breakthrough. "What's the issue?" she asked, glancing at the clock. "Distribution logistics," he blurted, thrusting a notepad into her hands. "I'm pitching a startup for eco-friendly packaging, but I can't figure out how to streamline the supply chain. I'm losing sleep over this." Simone leaned over the notepad, her mind sharpening. "Here's your bottleneck," she said, pointing to a key junction in his diagram. Grabbing a napkin from a nearby table, she quickly sketched a simplified solution. "If you consolidate shipments here and partner with a regional distributor, you'll reduce costs and delivery times." Desmond's face lit up, his panic replaced by awe. "That's brilliant, thank you so much. Honestly, I was about to scrap the whole thing." He offered a genuine smile. "You've got the makings of a brilliant businesswoman. I'll remember this." Simone waved off the compliment, suddenly realizing how little time she had left. "Good luck with your pitch," she said, hurrying toward the conference room. As she stepped inside, her heart pounded. Thankfully, the investor was running behind schedule. She used the extra moments to calm herself, inhaling deeply and grounding her thoughts. This was her moment. She wouldn't let nerves ruin it. The double doors opened, and the investor walked in. Simone's breath caught as her earlier advice came rushing back. It was Desmond. He paused, a flicker of surprise crossing his face before recognition set in. His smile widened, warm and amused. "Well, this is unexpected," he said, his tone playful but professional. Simone's palms grew clammy. She suddenly wondered if her earlier advice had helped, or if it had unintentionally revealed a weakness. Would he see her as unprepared? Someone who couldn't focus on her own pitch? Her doubts threatened to swallow her whole. But then she thought of Sadie's innocent question that morning. "Are you nervous?" And her own answer. "It's the good kind of nervous." She thought of Eli's drawings taped to the fridge, of every challenge she'd overcome this past year. This wasn't just for her, it was for them. Squaring her shoulders, Simone met Desmond's gaze with steady resolve. "It seems we meet again," she said, her voice confident. "Let's get started." Desmond's grin widened. "Let's." As Simone began her presentation, her voice trembled at first, but grew stronger with every slide. Her passion for her vision radiated through the room, her confidence building with every word. By the time she reached her final point, she was commanding the room with a presence that rivaled the bravado Everett once displayed when pitching his own business ideas. Desmond leaned back in his chair, nodding thoughtfully as she spoke, his expression unreadable but intent. When she finished, the room fell silent for a moment. Then Desmond stood, his smile warm and genuine, and extended his hand. "I think we'll make a great team," he said, his voice carrying a note of certainty that made her heart race. Simone shook his hand, her fingers trembling slightly as the reality of the moment settled in. She had done it. Her life was about to change once again. After the meeting, as the room emptied, Simone lingered. A question gnawed at her, and she couldn't leave without asking. "Can I ask you something?" Desmond paused, turning back toward her. "Of course." "When did you decide you'd work with me?" she asked, her voice steady but curious. "Was it after the presentation or before?" A soft smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, and his eyes crinkled as he regarded her. "Honestly? The moment you stopped to help me earlier. Most people would have brushed me off or been too caught up in their own agenda. But you didn't. That told me everything I needed to know. You're someone people can trust, Simone." Her cheeks warmed at his words, and for a moment she was speechless. She offered a small smile in return. "Thank you. That means more than you know." In the months that followed, their professional partnership flourished. Desmond's respect for Simone's vision and her relentless work ethic deepened, and Simone came to admire his kindness and humility. Together they built something incredible, their business growing rapidly under their shared leadership. But as their collaboration edged into something more personal, old scars began to surface. One evening, over a quiet dinner at a cozy restaurant, Desmond reached for her hand. "Simone," he began, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I care about you more than I can put into words. I know we've built something amazing together, but I want more than a partnership. I want forever. Will you marry me?" Tears sprang to Simone's eyes, and for a moment she was frozen. Then she pulled her hand back, trembling. "Desmond, I don't know if I can," she admitted, her voice breaking. "Everett once made promises too, and look where that got me. I gave him everything, and he left. What if you do the same?" Desmond's expression softened, and he reached out as if to comfort her but stopped, respecting the space she needed. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded, his resolve evident. "Just give me a while," he said gently. "I'll prove it to you." A week later, Desmond called Simone to his office. When she arrived, he handed her a portfolio of documents, his face calm but serious. "What's this?" she asked, flipping through the pages, her brows furrowing as she skimmed them. "My assets," he replied simply. "I've transferred them all to you." Simone's eyes widened, her breath catching. "What? Desmond, why would you do this?" "Because I mean what I said," he said firmly, his gaze unwavering. "If I ever leave, I walk away with nothing. You and your kids mean everything to me, Simone. I don't want you to say yes to my proposal out of pressure or fear. But I do want you to know that I'll never let you face life alone again. This is my promise. Her breath hitched, tears welling in her eyes. She stared at the papers, then at him, overwhelmed by the sincerity of his gesture. Desmond had been so good to her and her children, never asking for anything in return. Eli and Sadie adored him, their faces lighting up every time he came around. And now, standing before her, he had proven himself in a way no one else ever had. After a few moments, Simone looked up at him, her smile breaking through the tears streaming down her face. "Okay, Desmond," she whispered. "Yes." 7 years had passed, and Simone's life had transformed in ways she once thought impossible. Her business had flourished, and her days were filled with a joy she had barely dared to dream of. Desmond had been true to every word he'd spoken, standing by her side through triumphs and challenges alike. Together they had built not just a thriving business, but a loving family, welcoming their daughter, Chloe, into the world. Eli and Sadie doted on their baby sister, their laughter filling the house with warmth. On a crisp autumn morning, the family landed at a private airport after a week-long retreat. The sun bathed the tarmac in a golden glow as the jet's stairs descended. Chloe giggled as Simone helped her navigate the steps, her little hands gripping her mother's for balance. "I'm going to beat you to the car," Chloe declared, her tiny legs already sprinting across the tarmac. Desmond chuckled, swooping her up in midair and spinning her around as she shrieked with laughter. Simone smiled, her heart full as she watched her family. But as they walked toward the waiting car, a figure by another vehicle caught her eye, and her breath hitched. It was Everett. He stood by a weathered sedan, thinner and worn, his once polished confidence replaced by a haggard, defeated air. His clothes hung loosely on his frame, and his posture was stooped, as if the weight of his choices had finally caught up with him. When his eyes met Simone's, he froze, the shock evident in his expression. Simone's pulse quickened, but only briefly. She steadied herself, drawing strength from the man at her side. Desmond, sensing her unease, placed a reassuring hand on her back. Everett stepped forward hesitantly, forcing a weak smile. "Simone, you look—" His voice cracked, searching for words. "You look beautiful." Simone regarded him for a moment, her gaze calm but distant. "Thank you, Everett," she said evenly. For a brief moment the past hung between them like a shadow, memories of struggle, heartbreak, and the years she had spent rebuilding herself, but she quickly straightened, her eyes flicking to her husband and daughter. "I have to go now," she said, her tone firm but polite. "Take care." With that she turned and walked away, her heels clicking softly on the asphalt, each step exuding quiet confidence. Desmond gave Everett a brief glance, neither hostile nor friendly, before following his wife holding Chloe securely in his arms. Everett watched them go, a wave of nausea and despair washing over him. The woman he had once dismissed as part of his old, burdensome life had risen to heights he could now only dream of. The family she had rebuilt was a stark contrast to the emptiness that defined his own existence. As the limousine doors shut behind her, sealing her world away from his, the weight of his loss crashed down on him. He had gambled on fleeting freedom and lost everything that truly mattered. Later, Everett sat on the edge of a weathered park bench, clutching a worn briefcase. His fingers drummed nervously against the cracked leather, the gesture betraying his inner turmoil. His contact approached, impeccably dressed, with an air of practiced efficiency that only added to Everett's unease. "You're meeting someone who values family above all else," the man began without preamble, his tone flat and dispassionate. "He doesn't just invest in business ideas, he invests in people with principles." The words hit Everett like a blow to the gut. Once, family had been the foundation of his life, a source of strength and purpose. Now it felt like a distant memory, eroded by his own choices. His throat tightened, and he swallowed hard, barely managing to nod. "What happens if I don't meet those standards?" he ventured, his voice barely above a whisper. The question was more rhetorical than genuine, a reflection of his spiraling doubts. The man glanced at him, his expression sharp with disapproval. "Then you walk out of that room empty-handed," he replied curtly, his words as unyielding as the world Everett had chosen to leave behind. As the man walked away, his footsteps fading into the hum of the city, Everett remained rooted to the bench. His chest tightened and his mind churned for solutions. Only one idea surfaced, desperate and dangerous. Standing outside Simone's lavish home, Everett stared at the front door for longer than he wanted to admit. The mansion's grand exterior loomed, its pristine lawns and towering gates serving as silent reminders of how far apart their lives had grown. Summoning what little courage he had left, he knocked. Simone opened the door moments later, her expression shifting from mild surprise to guarded neutrality. The faint scent of freshly baked bread wafted out, a reminder of the homey warmth he had abandoned. Her tone, steady and firm, broke the silence. "What do you want, Everett?" Stepping inside, he couldn't help but notice the photos adorning the walls. Frames filled with snapshots of joy and togetherness, all featuring a man he didn't recognize, Desmond. The contrast between her current life and the chaos he had plunged into was glaring. "I need your help," he confessed, his voice almost breaking under the weight of his words. He turned to face her with eyes that seemed to have aged. "I have this investor meeting. They care about family and I need to show them I'm still someone who values that." Her eyes narrowed, crossing her arms instinctively. "And you think I'm going to pretend we're still a family?" she countered, trying to hide the disbelief in her voice. "Simone, it's not about us," he urged, his voice rising slightly as desperation seeped through. "It's about showing them I'm still worthy of trust. This could change everything for me. Help me climb back up." Her stance stiffened, not allowing her gaze to leave him. "Climb back up? That's all this is for you, a step back into the life you lost." Her voice grew softer, though the sadness in her eyes cut through his resolve. "You left this family behind, Everett. Left me, left the kids. Do you know how long it took to rebuild, to stop feeling like everything had been torn apart?" Her words pierced through him, guilt pulling his shoulders downward. He remained silent, unable to meet her eyes. Taking a deep breath, she unfolded her arms and turned toward the hallway. "Come with me." He followed her to the corridor leading to a room. Desmond sat at a small table, helping the kids with a jigsaw puzzle. His presence exuded calm strength, the kind Everett remembered once embodying. The children's faces lit up at every piece Desmond fit into place. "This," Simone whispered as she glanced back at Everett, "this is what family looks like now. Desmond has been here through every scraped knee, every bedtime story, every moment that mattered. What you're asking for is more than just a favor. It's a betrayal of everything I've built for them." Everett's gaze darted between her and the scene in the room. The realization of how deeply disconnected he'd become washed over him. "I never stopped caring," he admitted quietly, though the words sounded hollow, even to him. "No," she shook her head, not wanting to hear another word from him. "If you care, you'll find another way, one that doesn't involve us." Without waiting for his response, she returned to her family, leaving him alone in the empty hallway. The laughter of his children echoed faintly as he let himself out. The sound haunted him every step of the way. On the day of the meeting, Everett's nerves were frayed to the edge. As he stepped into the sleek high-rise office, his hands trembled despite his best efforts to steady them. The room was vast, every detail meticulously designed to exude power and authority. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of the city, while the polished marble table in the center seemed to reflect his every flaw. Taking a seat, Everett adjusted his tie, but the fabric suddenly felt like a noose tightening around his neck. His breath came shallow, and the ticking of the clock on the wall seemed deafening in the oppressive silence. When the door opened, he froze. Desmond walked in with a commanding presence, his tailored suit and calm demeanour amplifying the air of authority that already filled the room. Everett's blood ran cold, and for a moment he felt as though the ground might swallow him whole. Shame and embarrassment clung to him like a second skin. "You must be Everett," Desmond said, his tone courteous but devoid of warmth, as he extended a firm handshake. Everett managed a nod, his mouth dry and his face flushed. I didn't realize you were the investor," he stammered, barely able to meet Desmond's gaze. Desmond's expression remained composed, though a flicker of something, curiosity perhaps, passed across his eyes. "Please have a seat," he said, gesturing to the chair Everett had vacated in his panic. Everett sat stiffly, his heart pounding in his chest as Desmond took his place at the head of the table. The silence stretched unbearably before Desmond leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharp and probing. "Tell me something," Desmond began, his voice calm but deliberate. "What drives you?" The question caught Everett off guard. His mind scrambled for a polished answer, something that would paint him as ambitious, resilient, deserving. But under the weight of Desmond's unyielding stare, all he could summon was the unvarnished truth. "I had a family," Everett said finally, his voice faltering, "but I let them slip away, and now—" He swallowed hard, the words catching in his throat. "Now, all I can do is try to rebuild. Though I'm not sure I even deserve to." Desmond leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. The silence that followed felt like a verdict in itself, each second stretching into eternity. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but resolute. "Thank you for your time," Desmond said, rising to his feet and signalling the end of the meeting. Everett sat frozen for a moment, the hollow ache in his chest spreading as the finality of the encounter settled over him. Slowly he stood, his movements mechanical, and walked out of the room, his footsteps echoing in the vast, empty corridor. The following weeks blurred into a haze of regret and self-pity. Days slipped by unnoticed, each one bleeding into the next. One evening, with nothing left to his name, Everett found himself back in the dimly lit bar he had once frequented. The air was thick with the stench of stale beer and cheap cologne, and the sticky floor clung to his shoes with every step. He sat hunched over a glass of whiskey, its sharp, bitter taste doing little to dull the ache in his chest. The realization gnawed at him relentlessly. He had traded everything that mattered for a fleeting sense of freedom and success, and now he was left with nothing but the hollow echoes of his mistakes. A sharp knock on his door jolted him awake one morning, his head pounding from the previous night's indulgence. He shuffled to the door, his heart heavy with dread. When he opened it, his breath caught. Simone stood there, her expression a mix of concern and determination. She was dressed simply, her presence calm yet commanding. Her gaze swept over the disarray of empty bottles, crumpled papers and cluttered furniture behind him, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I heard what happened," she said finally, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. She sighed, shaking her head as she took in the wreckage of his life. "And I thought, maybe it's time you got a second chance." Everett blinked, the unexpected offer rendering him speechless. His voice cracked when he finally managed to speak. "Why?" he asked, his question laced with confusion and vulnerability. Simone met his gaze, her eyes softening. "For the kids," she said simply, but there was more in her expression. Compassion, yes, but also a flicker of pity and the faint remnants of the love she had once felt for him. It wasn't romantic anymore, but it was still human, still kind. Over the months that followed, Simone became a steady presence in Everett's life, though she made it clear that her support came with boundaries. She encouraged him to reconnect with Eli and Sadie, but always on her terms, and with the understanding that her new life with Desmond and Chloe would not be disrupted. At first, the process was awkward. The children were hesitant, unsure of how to reconcile the father they remembered with the man standing before them now. But slowly, Everett began to find his footing. With Simone's gentle nudges and the children's cautious warmth, he started to rebuild those fragile bonds. He found work. Nothing glamorous, but enough to begin piecing his finances back together. Each small step forward felt monumental, a reminder that redemption wasn't granted overnight but earned through perseverance. Simone watched from a distance, balancing her compassion with the need to protect the life she had built. She could see the changes in Everett, the way he carried himself now with a quiet humility that hadn't been there before. Years later, Everett opened the door to his modest but cozy home, welcoming Simone, Desmond, and the children inside. The space was simple but well kept, a reflection of the quiet stability he had worked hard to build. The aroma of roasted chicken and freshly baked bread wafted through the air, mingling with the sound of children's laughter as Eli, Sadie, and Chloe explored the small but inviting living room. The dinner was unassuming, but heartfelt. Everett had prepared the meal himself, and though the dishes weren't extravagant, the care he had put into each one was evident. Around the table, conversation flowed easily, the years of tension and pain gradually giving way to warmth and camaraderie. The children's laughter punctuated the evening, their joy infectious as they shared stories and teased one another over dessert. As the plates were cleared and the conversation began to wind down, Everett reached for a small package wrapped in plain brown paper. His movements were deliberate, almost hesitant, as he slid it across the table towards Simone. "I wanted to give you this," he said quietly, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. Simone looked at him curiously before unwrapping the gift. Inside was a simple wooden frame holding an old photograph of her and the children, taken years ago, during a time when life had been far from easy. The edges of the photo were slightly worn, but it had been carefully preserved. Her fingers brushed over the frame, her eyes softening as she took in the image. "Thank you, Everett," she murmured, her voice quiet but sincere. The significance of the gesture was not lost on her. Everett cleared his throat, his gaze fixed on the table as he spoke. "It's me who should be thanking you and Desmond," he admitted, his voice thick with gratitude. "For everything, for giving me another chance, for helping me find my way back to the man I should have been all along." Desmond nodded, his expression kind. "We're proud of you, Everett. You've come a long way." The air between them seemed to lighten, the weight of old wounds replaced by something gentler. There was a quiet understanding, a sense of closure that neither Simone nor Everett had thought was possible. As the evening drew to a close, Everett watched the children play together, their laughter filling the house. For the first time in years, he felt a profound sense of peace. He wasn't defined by his mistakes anymore, but by the person he had worked to become. And as Simone and Desmond said their goodbyes, Everett stood in the doorway, his heart full. He had lost much, but he had also been given a gift, a chance to heal, to reconnect, and to create a life worth living. It was a modest life, but it was his, and for that he was endlessly grateful.